Tommy was 5 years old when something extraordinary happened in a church in the state of Michigan. What came out of this boy's mouth that Sunday morning made 200 people stop breathing. This is the miracle that changed a family forever. Susan had been raising her grandson Tommy since he was a baby. Tommy's parents died in a car accident when the boy was only 8 months old. Susan, a widow and already retired, took on the responsibility of raising her grandson. Before we continue, write here in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is moving to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. At the age of 2, Tommy was diagnosed with a profound case of autism. He had never spoken a single word. The months went by, and Tommy remained in complete silence. Susan's life revolved entirely around Tommy. 3 times a week she took him to the speech therapist, twice a week to physical therapy, once a month an appointment with the neurologist, Dr. Thompson. Waiting rooms became part of her daily life, the smell of alcohol in the clinics, the constant sound of children crying or calling for their parents. It was a tiring routine marked by long hours of waiting and silent car rides. Even so, Susan never complained. On the contrary, with each appointment she carried with her a quiet hope that maybe that day something different would happen with Tommy. Tommy attended a specialized school. His teacher, Mrs. Johnson, always commented that Tommy was different from the other children. "He has something special in his eyes," she would say. At home, Tommy had very specific routines. He woke up at 6:30 in the morning. He always had breakfast in the same chair, using the same blue cup. He only played with 3 toys, a red little car, which he slowly pushed in a straight line across the floor, building blocks, which he did not use to build towers, but to create perfect rows, knocking them down forcefully if anyone dared move a piece, and a worn-out brown teddy bear he had received on his first birthday. He held the teddy tightly, pressing it against his chest as if it were his anchor. Any attempt to change the order of these toys made him restless, but when he managed to line everything up just the way he wanted, a rare and delicate smile would appear on his face. These small gestures were what lit up Susan's heart. Tommy never showed interest in children's TV programs. He did not react to music. He was not drawn to colorful books. The only exception was on Sundays. Tommy became visibly calmer on Sundays. And when Susan said, "Let's go to church," he would immediately walk to the door. In church, Tommy behaved in a unique way. He walked straight to the 3rd pew on the right side and fixed his gaze on the statue of the Virgin Mary. Throughout the entire Mass, he remained in that position. Susan noticed that Tommy moved his lips during Mass, as if he were whispering. He would pause, move his lips again, pause, as if he were speaking to someone. During the first few months, Susan thought it was just normal behavior, but after some months, Susan realized that Tommy only showed this lip movement in 2 specific places: at church, looking at the Virgin Mary, and at home, by the bedroom window at night. Every night before going to sleep, Tommy would get up and go to the window. The glass fogged slightly with the cold of the night, and a breeze slipped through the thin curtain, making it sway gently. He stood still, gazing at the sky as if searching for something beyond the stars. Slowly he brought his hands together, took a deep breath, and moved his lips silently for long minutes. The silence of the room was broken only by the distant sound of crickets outside. Then, with the same calm, he returned to bed and covered himself as if he had fulfilled a sacred ritual. One night Susan approached while Tommy was at the window. "Are you talking to someone?" she whispered. Tommy turned, looked directly at her, something rare, and nodded yes. "With whom?" Susan pressed. Tommy pointed toward the sky, then placed his hand on his chest. Susan was intrigued. Perhaps Tommy was referring to his parents, who had passed away. But how could a child who had never met his parents be referring to them? She decided not to push further. and simply observe. Susan spoke with Dr. Thompson about what she had been observing. It is common for autistic children to develop specific rituals for certain environments, he explained. This can help them feel safe. But there's something different, Susan insisted. Tommy only does these lip movements in church and at the window at home, nowhere else. At school, Mrs. Johnson also began noticing subtle changes. Tommy has been more present during activities. Yesterday, he drew something that looked like a human figure for the first time. Susan asked to see the drawing. It was simple, but it showed a female figure with something covering her head. At home, Susan kept observing Tommy's patterns. The nightly visits to the window were absolutely consistent. They lasted between 5 and 10 minutes, regardless of weather or temperature. Tommy did this every night, without exception. Over the following weeks, Tommy began responding to simple questions with clearer gestures. When Susan asked if he wanted water, he nodded yes or no. Small steps, but definite ones. Doctor. Thompson grew interested in Susan's reports. Tommy is showing improvement in communication. Keep encouraging these interactions. Susan noticed that Tommy responded better when he was calm. The best moments were after his visits to the window and before going to church on Sundays. Whenever she mentioned church, Tommy became more attentive. On a Wednesday afternoon, Tommy took Susan's hand and led her to the closet where the Sunday clothes were kept. Susan understood. He wanted to go to church. Tommy, today is not Sunday. The church is closed. Tommy seemed to understand, but he was clearly disappointed. Susan noticed that Tommy had developed his own language through gestures and expressions. It wasn't just nodding yes or no. He used varied facial expressions and even guided Susan through the house when he wanted something specific. During physiotherapy sessions, the therapist Sarah commented that Tommy seemed more coordinated. He is following simple instructions better than before. There is a general improvement in his body awareness. Susan began to realize that the changes in Tommy were happening gradually, but consistently. He was more present in the world, more connected with the people around him, especially with her. During Mass, Tommy's lip movements became more elaborate. Susan noticed that he paused as if he were listening to something, then resumed as if he were answering. The pattern definitely seemed like a conversation. On Sunday, Susan woke up to a strange noise at 5:30 in the morning. They were footsteps in the hallway, firm, determined steps, completely different from Tommy's usual movements. When she went down to the kitchen, she found a scene that left her speechless. Tommy was fully dressed in his Sunday clothes, the light blue shirt she always had to help him button, the dress pants he normally refused to wear, the black shoes that usually caused tantrums. Everything was flawless, as if an invisible force had dressed him with perfection. But that was not all. Tommy was standing beside the kitchen table with an upright, almost solemn posture. His hands were folded in front of his body, and his eyes, normally vague and distant, had a focus Susan had never witnessed before. "Tommy, how did you dress yourself?" Susan asked, still processing the scene. Tommy looked directly at her, a prolonged, intense gaze, and then pointed at the clock on the wall. Susan prepared the usual breakfast: toast with jam, warm milk in the blue cup, a banana sliced into perfectly equal rounds. But Tommy did something unthinkable. He shook his head in a clear, definite no. In 5 years, he had never once refused his eating routine. "Tommy, you need to eat," Susan insisted. But he got up from the chair, took Susan's purse from the sideboard in the entrance, then went to the hook where the car keys hung. He picked them up and walked to the door. "Tommy, it's only 6:30 in the morning. Mass doesn't start until 9. Tommy remained motionless at the door, waiting with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Watching her grandson's inexplicable behavior, Susan made a decision she would later consider the most important of her life. "All right, Tommy, let's go." When they arrived at the church at 7 o'clock, the parking lot was completely empty. Susan parked in the usual spot and waited for Tommy to get out of the car, but he remained still in the back seat. He was staring at the church with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Tommy, we've arrived," Susan said, but he did not move. He kept observing the church for a full 3 minutes, as if he were evaluating something only he could see. Then, suddenly, he opened the door and stepped out with precise movements. Bob, the caretaker, was sweeping the entrance steps when he saw them approaching. "Susan, you came quite early today. Is everything all right?" But before she could respond, Bob stopped sweeping and fixed his eyes on Tommy. "That boy is different today. There is something in his eyes." Susan looked at Tommy and felt the same. There was a seriousness in his expression, a maturity that did not match a 5-year-old child. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Bob continued, still watching Tommy with curiosity. "I'll finish preparing the altar." Tommy went straight to his pew, but he did not sit down immediately. He remained standing, looking around as if orienting himself. Then he positioned himself differently, straighter, more upright. For 2 hours, from 7 to 9, Tommy maintained a concentration Susan had never witnessed before. His lips moved intensely. It was not involuntary movement. Susan observed changes in Tommy's expression during those 2 hours. He smiled several times. He nodded as if agreeing. There were moments when he seemed to be asking questions, and others when he appeared to be receiving instructions. At 8:30 the congregation began to arrive. Families entered. Children played in the aisles, the usual Sunday murmur. Tommy finally sat down, but he kept his full focus on the statue of the Virgin Mary. Father Michael began the Mass. During hymns and readings, Tommy remained in absolute concentration, and it was precisely at 9:43, while Father Michael was speaking about the importance of faith, that Susan noticed a change in her grandson's behavior. Tommy slowly rose from the pew. Susan thought Tommy was going to the bathroom, but he headed toward the altar. The entire congregation noticed immediately. A 5-year-old boy who had never spoken, walking alone during Mass. Father Michael stopped in the middle of the homily. Silence spread throughout the church. 200 people turned their eyes to Tommy, who walked with steady steps down the central aisle. Tommy stopped directly in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. The morning light created a special atmosphere around the image. He looked up, put his hands together, and the impossible happened. For the first time in 5 years, Tommy opened his mouth. His voice echoed clearly through the church, filled with innocence and purity. "Mary?" The sound was distinct, firm, without hesitation. As if that word had been kept inside him all this time, waiting only for the right moment to be born. Before anyone could react, Tommy raised his hands and continued, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." Each sentence came out perfect, without hesitation, as if he were being guided. It was impossible to imagine how a child who had never uttered words could recite with such clarity and devotion. The silence in the church was absolute. The only sound was Tommy's voice echoing through the walls and rising like a hymn to heaven. Susan, overcome with tears, pressed her hands against her chest. For her there was no doubt something supernatural was happening before her eyes. Tommy completed the entire prayer. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." When he finished, he remained in silence, looking upward. His lips were still moving, without sound, as if he were hearing a response that no one else could hear. For a few seconds, the silence was so profound that even the sound of the burning candles seemed too loud. Then, with serenity, he walked back to the pew and sat down. Susan embraced him tightly, her heart racing. It was then that Tommy, now with effort and pauses, began to speak like a child, learning to use his own voice. "Grandma, the beautiful lady, said that I can speak now." Susan, in tears, whispered softly, "Who is this lady, Tommy?" He pointed to the statue of the Virgin Mary and answered with simplicity, "She speaks to me. Here, and at the window, she taught me the prayer." Father Michael approached, his eyes filled with tears. "Tommy, what else does she tell you?" The boy looked at him with unusual serenity and replied, "She teaches me about God. And she said that I am never alone." At that moment, dozens of people fell to their knees. Others wept in silence. There was an atmosphere of reverence that no one could explain. For that community there was no doubt. They were witnessing the miracle of the Virgin Mary, who had given voice to a boy who had lived in silence for 5 years. Today, Tommy is 7 years old. His speech is still slow, but it improves every day. He can communicate with classmates, has friends, and smiles more often. But every Sunday, in the same pew, he continues to look at the image of the Virgin Mary with devotion. And Susan at his side knows she will never forget the day her entire church witnessed a sign from heaven, the day when the Virgin Mary gave her grandson his voice back. This is the miracle of the Virgin Mary in Tommy's life, the boy who remained mute for 5 years until the day heaven decided the world needed to hear his voice. And I want to know from you, do you believe in the miracles of the Virgin Mary? Write your opinion in the comments or even a testimony you have lived. I will love to read and share in this faith with you, and if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because every day I bring testimonies of miracles of the Virgin Mary that strengthen faith